Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tentacom video, we're going to be discussing what can you expect from next generation consoles in terms of not only their performance, but in terms of what they're going to be doing for next generation games. Now, this is a pretty in-depth topic, so we're going to be discussing a lot of the basics in this one, and we're also probably going to have to create a second part because I have a feeling this is going to become fairly lengthy. So, first of all, let's talk about the current generation before we jump excitedly headlong into the next generation. And we're only going to spend a few minutes doing this, so it's worth talking about it. So, currently, of course, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 are getting pretty long in their tooth. They've been out for 6-7 years now, and you know, their hardware has pretty much been maxed out. We can't really get much more out of the hardware, as you are all aware by now. However, there are still some stunning games being released. The latest God of War, of course, was incredible on the PlayStation 3, and then we've recently been enjoying The Last of Us, which, as I mentioned in my thoughts and opinions of The Last of Us, the second part, which is available on this channel, of course, I did mention that I was extremely impressed just how much the PS3 was being pushed, and to be honest with you, despite the fact that there are a few niggles in terms of the graphics and frame rate occasionally, for the most part it is very impressive visually, especially when you consider just how old the hardware is. And the problem, of course, with a lot of games on both the Xbox 360 and PS3 is natively they are either running in 720p or internally they're actually even at a lower resolution rate. So, for example, they may be at, say, 600p. And this is simply a function of the fact that they keep pushing the graphics as far as they can go, but something has to give. So, to make better graphics, you have to either lower the resolution to free up resources for either better polygon count, or better textures, or better viewing distances, and so forth, or, conversely, the other option is to have a fixed frame rate which is lower than what would be ideal. For example, to have, say, 30 FPS rather than 60, because obviously the more time it takes for a frame to update, the longer it actually has to draw that. So in other words, 30 FPS gives you more performance in terms of more headroom than 60. It's that simple. So when they're designing a game, they have to make a decision on what frame rate they want. Now, certain games, such as God of War, went the variable route. In other words, the frame rate goes up and down based upon what's on screen, and therefore, if something's not too actiony, if it's more of a pretty looking landscape, for example, not too many enemies, so combat is not really the problem, they can focus on hammering through as much graphical fidelity as possible. On the other hand, if the reverse is true and there's a lot of enemies on screen and so forth, then they can somewhat cut that down, they can reduce it, and they can focus on things to actually make it play better. Evidently, the hardware has been pushed to the limit, but still, when you consider just how old the hardware is, it's very hard not to be impressed. Indeed, even in the Killzone PDF, the breakdown for Shadowfall, which of course I've done an in-depth analysis of, both on lighting and the textures and everything else, they've mentioned that quite a lot of the techniques they actually used, in fact pretty much all of them, have been around for a while. So even stuff like HDR, which of course stands for High Dynamic Range Lighting, various forms of tessellation, bump mapping, displacement, everything has really been around. The difference is you can't really push it to the limit. There's not really been the power there to throw everything together. Now obviously when the PS3 and Xbox 360 came out, it was a smorgasbord because everyone was getting used to the power difference between that generation and the previous generation from that, which of course was the PS2, Xbox One, and so on. So the problem was the jump. When they went from, 480p or 480i to 720p, it took a lot of power. Now, let's fast forward to this generation. This generation, of course, we've got both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Now, both are aiming at 1080p rather than 720p, which is quite a difference in resolution. So obviously that needs a lot of extra power to pump that resolution out. This is another reason that both systems, by the way, have quite a lot of RAM, because the resolution for the textures and everything else that is required to pump that, or should I say to keep the GPU fed, requires a hell of a lot of memory. So, and of course you have the Jaguar APU, which of course is outfitted with the GCN cores and everything else, and we know roughly, of course, 1.84 T-flops for the PS4 and 1.2 odd for the Xbox One. The question is, however, what does that actually mean? And by which I mean, does that mean that we're now going to get 1080p frame rates at, say, 60 frames per second? So 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second. That sounds a little bit better, doesn't it? Does that mean that we're going to be seeing 60 frames per second all the time? Does that mean that we're going to be seeing incredible graphics? Well, there are a few things that developers really need to decide, and that is how much they're going to sacrifice in terms of visual quality for better frame rates. Now, what we're seeing right now, most titles, for example, on the Frostbite engines, they seem to be running in 60 frames per second, and it seems that they're pretty adamant to make them running at 60 frames per second. However, there is a bit of an argument going on. One of them is that currently we're at this middling ground. We're at this ground where current generation consoles, so that would be, of course, the PS3 and Xbox 360, are holding back the new generation. They're basically, engines now are built to be compatible with the previous generation and the next generation. Just how they are built to also be able to run on low power PCs, in other words, low spec or older PCs, as well as the newest high range PCs, and even a variety of different other devices as well. In some cases, engines must be capable of running on smartphones, all the way to tablets, all the way to low-power laptops, all the way up to ridiculously expensive gaming machines, such as really high-end tri-GPU PCs. One of the other benefits of this, specifically with FPS in 60 frames a second, is that quite simply you get much better response, especially from controls. Now, obviously, both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox are both really happy with their control schemes. They're pushing the fact that they have much higher bandwidth available. They're pushing the fact that the controls are much more responsive. They have better tactile feedback on the analog sticks and so on. But all of this means absolute dirt if quite simply put, the game either lags or just doesn't feel responsive. It's a huge deal. And honestly speaking, the more responsive something is, the better for everyone. And that's one of the really big reasons that people game on PC. Because 1080p, 60 frames per second. But how long can this last? That's a really good question. Now obviously, developers are always going to be able to push stuff. They're always going to be able to say, okay, the next generation is going to look better, because the next generation of games are going to look better because we have better programming techniques, we have better understanding of the hardware, we have better understandings of our own software, and so on and so forth. Now we know titles such as Call of Duty and so on, and even Battlefield 4 just was not running on a genuine Xbox One hardware at the conference, the E3 conference, of course. In fact, it was running on pretty much a PC. And that PC was actually higher end specifications. What we understand, it was using a GTX 780 graphics card, which is far higher end GPU power than the Xbox One or even the PlayStation 4 can muster. So that shows that, of course, they're going to have to be doing a lot of optimizations, especially since the AMD Jaguar CPUs, the cores, I mean, are not that high end. I mean, they're, mid-range performance at best in terms of if you compare them to PC. So a lot of the performance is going to be coming from optimization and understanding exactly how far you can push the hardware. So as I've said earlier, you've got engines that are supporting 7-year hardware. More to the point, you've got devices out there right now which are approaching the power of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The video have said quite openly that they believe the next range of mobile phone hardware that's going to be released is really going to be pushing the same type of GPU performance as the PS4 3 is right now. So imagine what in, say, 4 years' time we're actually going to have in the palm of our hand. The graphics are going to be phenomenal. Now, of course, there are a few concerns with that, including battery life and so on. So it's going to become a while before this becomes the norm. In other words, before we have graphics that are, say, Xbox 360 quality in the palm of our hands. But regardless, imagine just how far we're going to be in, say, 4 or 5 years' time. Now, to illustrate this point, think of this. Right now, engines are very cross-platform based. Why? Because, honestly speaking, it's the only way you can make a lot of money. You've got the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, and the Wii U, and they are going to be holding up the development of the next generation titles. So the question is, one, it no longer becomes financially profitable to support those titles on older platforms. For example, the next Call of Duty, whatever that's going to be called. For example, let's just call it Ghost 3. Obviously, that's not been confirmed, just to point that out, but let's just assume in, say, 3 years' time they release Ghost 3. And let's assume at that point that EA or whomever else who are developing these titles, whether it's Ghost 3, whether it's Battlefield 6, whatever, let's assume at that point that they decide, you know what, we don't believe that the market for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 is no longer big enough to really put these titles on that system. I think that we should just go whole hog and we should just support the next generation consoles, which of course would then be the current generation consoles, as well as PC or whatever else devices happen to be out at that point. And then, of course, they have some decisions to make as developers. They have to say, well, what do we want? Now, the problem, of course, with frame rate, and this has been something I've been saying for a long time now, the problem with frame rate and other details such as frame rate, such as AI, physics, and so on, it's very hard to put those onto a box art or a very small trailer and say, this is it. This is, you know, the next generation. For example, how can you show AI? You could show scenarios that are, you know, look good, or that the enemy responds well in, or that the, you know, your teammates respond well in, or whatever you're playing. But let's be honest, it's not really easy to show that in, say, a 20-second advert on television. Similarly, physics. Okay, you could show dust debris particles all day long, and you can even show nice water, but once again, a lot of the stuff just is simply not easy to show off in the box, therefore it means less sales. Similarly, you've got other issues with all of this as well. People expect to see much better graphics, and they don't necessarily expect to see better, let's say, AI. They've almost learned to live with this stuff right now. They learn to live with their teammates getting in the way just for a second, but you know what? They want to see a much better looking textures. And as I was saying, developers at some point or another need to start plowing in this GPU power or CPU power to other things. They need to start making decisions on whether this level of performance, this 60 frames per second, is going to be basically something that they want to attain all the time, or whether it's going to just be because of this transitionary period between GPU and CPU improvements compared to the last generation. But once we're used to that generation, or this next generation, shall I say, they're going to disappear. In other words, you no longer have to hold those as requirements. You no longer have to hold those as, okay, this is what we need to attain. Instead, you start to sacrifice that for better image quality or to make things look pretty. Now, obviously, not all titles need 60 frames per second to run and, you know, feel great. It's just that simple. Something like, say, Final Fantasy just doesn't. On the other hand, it's things that have tactile and real-time combat. For example, Skyrim. You can actually notice a real difference because I was playing it side by side. Amata had it on the Xbox 360 at the time. I think she's now bought it on PC, I'm not sure. And I was playing it on PC. And we're basically both playing it side by side. Her on one screen, myself on another. She bought like her Xbox round and everything else. And this is on launch. And the difference between the two, as in the frame rate, never mind the graphics, was pretty profound. And I could just tell that it would really bug me, just the frame rate. And I'm not saying the frame rate on the 360 was bad, it's just when you've played it and you're used to like almost 60 frames per second constantly on PC, it's quite tangible. There are also other concerns, of course. It is not just a case of just providing details and abilities for artists to create better looking rocks or better looking trees. Reality of the matter is that we also want better looking worlds, but sure, those are good, but we also want more open, more engaged environments. For example, if you guys have seen what Metal Gear Solid looks like in the next generation Phantom Pain, and you could see that it's plain that we are entering a new era. This game has obviously been built from scratch for the next consoles, and you could see that, yes, the level of detail and so on is much better. Yes, there is a lot more to the environments. They're a lot larger, they're a lot more open. Obviously, you've got titles currently, like, for example, Red Dead Redemption, Skyrim, and so on, which allow you to explore pretty vast areas. I mean, even Grand Theft Auto 4. I'm not going to comment on 5 because obviously it's not out yet, and I don't really want to comment on titles that aren't out apart from Metal Gear Solid because obviously we've seen quite a big trailer of it. And it's very obvious that, yes, we can enter these worlds, but there are limits on what you can do with them. Even The Last of Us, despite the fact that I absolutely love the game on the PS3, there are always these little artificial restrictions that bug you. And obviously you can never have a realistic, 100% realistic games, because otherwise it will become ridiculous. Like, for example, on The Last of Us, you run out of rags and other cloth to do various things with. However, obviously you have various cutting implements because you use those to make shivs. So why is it, if I'm going through an old abandoned house, for example, why can't I just use those cutting implements to, say, tear off pieces of the curtains or whatever? And obviously there have to be certain limits. Now, I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that really bug me when I'm playing like an FPS, and I'm really enjoying it, and then I see this enemy that goes behind cover, and it's like, I swear to God, like a piece of paper or something, like a wooden fence or a chain link fence or a small bush, and I cackle evilly and, fire a rocket launcher at that sucker, and it explodes, and just as the mist is clearing and I expect to see, half a dozen bodies, no, not even slightly. This one blade of grass or whatever happened to be standing in the way between the soldier and, my rocket, pretty much saved him. And that's where physics and so forth come in. So, obviously, we do have quite a bit to go now. Microsoft are very keen to impose their cloud-based vision upon us, and obviously that's going to have some benefits, especially in titles like, say, Skyrim, because it allows large, persistent worlds. In other words, the world can change and interact, and new quests can spawn, and new enemies could, be born or die or whatever, while you are, at least in theory, safely tucked up in bed and your Xbox One is disabled because the game's actually playing out in real time. In theory, all this stuff can happen. And that's fantastic, and I actually quite like that idea. But, it's not 100% able to help with some computing tasks, as we've already discussed in a few videos before. So just how much of an impact that's really going to have is hard to know. So the question is, just how much is the next generation going to buy us? And if we get used to 60 frames per second, if we get used to 1080p, are we going to be happy with it? Now, bear in mind, there's a difference between natively internally rendered and also what is shown. For example, I'll give you guys a really bad example of this, but one that bears the test of time. You can get an image, for example, say a photograph of, a hill or something. You can take that in Photoshop, and let's say that resolution will say 720 by, 480, just for example. And then you could go ahead and you can blow that up in Photoshop to like 1920 by 1080 or whatever. And yes, the image is now bigger. Congratulations. But it hasn't manufactured more details. A similar problem, of course, as I said earlier, exists right now with current consoles. The pixels are just not there. If a game's rendered internally at 600p, you can scale it up to 1080p, and that's great, and it will definitely look better than, what most TVs can do, because the console's doing it, but still, 720p or 600p is still considerably less than 1080p. It's that simple. So whether we're going to see these sacrifices start echoing through, whether we're going to be seeing much better AI and everything else is obviously going to be the thing. Now, the bottom line is, you can only push a piece of hardware a certain amount, and this is the issue with fixed hardware, such as, say, the Xbox or PlayStation 4. There is a finite amount that you can push it. And as I said, cloud-based solutions help in some respects, and they have some interesting applications. I will grant you, 100%. But once again, they are not a silver bullet. They do not cure every problem known to man. So at the end of the day, it's once again a function of limited hardware. Now, we are going to definitely be able to push these consoles a hell of a lot, but just how long it's going to be before the magical 1080p internal resolution no longer becomes a priority. Instead, we start focusing on better visuals. This is especially true with the Xbox One. There's no getting around this. If you have a title on the Xbox One, and you have a title on the Xbox One's competitor, the PS4, it's not very difficult to realize that there has to be some level of give there. It is a simple math. The PS4 has more graphical fidelity available, more graphical power available than that of the Xbox. It is a simple mathematical equation. Therefore, we're going to get situations where, for example, the PS4 version runs at, say, 1080p, and the Xbox One version runs at, say, 720p internally. Or are we going to get examples where one version runs at 60 frames per second, another one runs at, say, 30, or one with fixed frame rate, one at variable? This is very, very interesting stuff, and we'll know about it soon enough, I'm sure. By soon enough, I mean a couple of years. All of these questions are strange, perhaps, if you've not really thought about them, because you think to yourself, what does it matter to you? I mean, you're going to be getting better games, yes, but the question has never been for me, will the next generation of games look better? Right? I've been playing games since, well, let's just say I've been playing them for a long time, yeah? Let's just say that I owned an Atari 2600. I was really young at the time, and the console was actually pretty old even when I owned it, but I basically have been playing games since I was a kid, like really young. And I've played on Master System, Genesis / Mega Drive, whatever you want to call it. I owned Saturns, PlayStations, PS2s, various gaming PCs, including Spectrums, and goodness knows what else. So what I'm trying to tell you guys is a little bit around the block. So when someone, says, well, thanks to the power of the PS4, we're going to be seeing larger, better graphics. Of course, that's like me saying to you, well, you know what, the sun is going to rise tomorrow. It's an obvious statement, yeah? But what I want to see is, I want to see a better improvements on AI and everything else. I want to see just how far we're going to go before we see some sacrifices for this stuff. The E3 stuff was very impressive, as I've mentioned previously in another video. It was good looking, it had a solid frame rate and so forth, but yes, it is an evolution of what we currently have. But you may remember that in that E3 video, one of the things I said specifically was that it didn't really blow me away. There were a couple of games that, yes, they did look impressive. I'll just use the PS4 just for a moment, because I'm sure pretty much everyone's seen the Killzone. Yes, it looked amazing. I'm not going to argue it did look very impressive. Yes, it looked a hell of a lot better than previous console titles. Yes, it looked better than, you know, a lot of PC stuff now. It did, the lighting and so forth. But that's because it's on a new, shiny engine. But if you really look up close, the textures and so on aren't that much better than a lot of the PC stuff out there now. I'm talking about like Crysis 3. I have done a visual comparison, by the way, on some of the stuff, so you guys can check out Killzone. You can just search on the channel, you can see the various comparisons I made. And obviously they are rough, yeah? I'm not saying that Killzone looks better, and I'm not saying it looks worse. It's all down to perspective. Just how I can tell you that I think Crysis looks better than, say, Call of Duty, but you may prefer the look of Call of Duty's engine. But what is it hard to argue is that yes, we are in the first generation of stuff, and the second and third generation of games on the console. We're obviously going to improve this, but there are going to become limits. So I want to see just how far we can push the hardware, and I'd like to see this graphical fidelity. Now, obviously, one of the benefits of the PS4 and the Xbox, for that matter, is the fact that the GCN cores can actually do compute tasks. Now, these compute tasks are numerous. We know they can do AI, we know they can do physics, they can even do stuff like memory defragmentation, and that was actually used extensively in Killzone. But the question you've got to ask yourself whenever you start thinking about stuff like this is, what is it going to take away from the graphics card to actually do this stuff? I'll give you guys an example. Let's say you were to buy Batman Arkham City on the PC. And let's assume, just for a moment, that you have a NVIDIA graphics card, right? And let's assume that it's not the highest graphics card available. Let's assume it's like, I don't know, a GTX 650 boost or something similar. Or maybe a little bit further down, maybe a little bit up, but around that region. And let's assume that you want to play at 1080p. And let's assume that you want AA and anti-aliasing and strobe filtering. All the other goodies on, right? And let's also assume that, hey, you know what? I want hardware physics. And we could argue about how well implemented hardware physics is for Batman, but let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that it's well implemented. And then let's say to ourselves that let's do a frame rate test. Now, obviously, the moment you enable hardware physics, you're going to watch your frame rate tank. It is simple. And that's the same for Metro and other titles as well. Now, obviously, if you have the GPU power spare, and you say to yourself, okay, with this enabled, I have got 50 to 60 frames per second, or whatever you find is acceptable on that title. Without it, sure, it goes up, but it doesn't really affect me, therefore I might as well have hardware physics. But let's then fast forward in, say, let's go with, say, 18 months' time, and let's assume that you still have the same card, and then therefore you have to make the same decision. Will you enable hardware physics, right, with the next generation of games? You'd have to think about that, especially if your frame rate would then start dipping to below the magic number, below the 30. And this is the thing that console manufacturers, console developers are going to have to start struggling with. Internally, they're going to ask themselves, okay, we have this amount of computational power to work with. That's set in stone. That is black and white. Unless Sony release like an update which is going to overclock the PS4's CPU and GPU, that's a given. They can do stuff such as optimize the game to make it run better, they can learn the hardware, and they can make various other sacrifices, but at the end of the day, the hardware's fixed. So they have to say to themselves, okay, do we want to, say, put, let's just say 100 G-flops of computing power, which is about 1/18 of what the PS4 has. Do we want to use that for physics? Or do we want to use that for graphics because we don't think the frame rate is quite stable enough? Or do we want to use like 200 G-flops or 300 G-flops? Remember, the GTX, the high-end cards now for PC have much more than 1.84. You know, we're talking 3 T-flops plus. Now, obviously, the benefit of consoles is that they have extensive levels of optimization, and much more than any PC titles can have. So it's more than possible that the PS4's 1.84 could be comparable to something like 3.4, 3.6 on a PC. Maybe even better, we don't know. Because obviously it is heavily optimized. That game will work on that PlayStation 4. It has been designed from the ground up for that PlayStation 4 hardware. It is that simple. Now obviously when you start talking about multi-platform development environments, so for example the Call of Duties of the world, that's where things start getting a bit more sticky. So anyway guys, after all of that has been said and done, what are your thoughts on this? You can, of course, leave them under the video responses, of course, or you can reply on Facebook, which would be facebook.com/redgamingtech. With all of that said, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.